In a fiery State of the Union address, President Biden took on foreign policy, immigration, abortion rights, and the U.S. economy, sharing both his vision and his goals. With a likely rematch with former President Donald Trump coming in the fall, President Biden turned his State of the Union speech into an argument for a second term at the White House. Dr. Daniel Cronrath, a political science professor at Florida State College at Jacksonville, joins us this morning to break it down. Good morning to you. Thank you so much. We always appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective.
Good morning, Vic. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It is great. And last night was a late one for the State of the Union. So not everybody got to watch it, but they've been seeing the recaps here this morning on the morning show. First of all, what is your reaction to the president's addresses? Were there any surprises there for you?
Well, I think it was a very, very typical State of the Union address in some regards, in the fact that the president came out, he tried to outline a clear vision for his second term. He tried to frame the first 3 years of his presidency in a positive way. I think the other thing that a lot of people were watching, too, with a lot of criticisms about the president's age, about the president's cognitive skills, is how would he perform? And by all accounts, the president came out last night and he was fiery. He looked lively. He was at times willing to take on hecklers from the GOP caucus who were calling him out on his agenda, literally going off of his teleprompter and off script and trying to do that. So I think from a standpoint, did the president look lively? Did he look ready to go out there and face the American people? He did, and I think in that regard it's positive. But for a lot of the language, you know, a lot of aspirational goals without a lot of detail, which is very, very typical of State of the Unions. And I think the other lasting thing was the solidarity within the Democratic Party last night, Vic, was tremendous. A lot of applause, the left wing of the party and the center, or the center of the Democratic Party, really uniting around this president and saying, this is our guy. For better or for worse, this is our guy moving forward.
And that's a big move, too, because there's been a lot of scrutiny. There's been a lot of talk about his policies, about his age.
Right.
So it's interesting to see something like that. So in President Biden's past State of the Union addresses, he has taken a more moderate approach here, more moderate stance. Last night, though, we saw that he was more targeted, and he was really trying to win voters over to his side, knowing that he's facing this likely rematch. What's your take on that? It definitely got political.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. I mean, the president, I think one of the things that the president was very dogged on was his support for Ukraine, which both nationally and now even increasingly in his own party, many Americans are asking questions like, you know, for example, we can't afford to provide mortgage relief for homeowners in the United States, yet we can somehow manage to spend over $100 billion in a package to send money to Ukraine, money to Israel, and also to shore up our southern border. I think other complaints that could come out, you know, at least from the perspective of folks that I've talked to, is if any one of these individual items are important, why aren't they separated into separate pieces of legislation? Why are we pushing forward an entire large package of over $100 billion? And the answer to that is because the president wants to be able to meet his priorities of funding Ukraine while trying to also satisfy House Republican and Senate Republican desires to spend more money on our southern border and to bring it more up to speed with where they would like to see, to talk about the things the president addressed like that, crime, fentanyl coming across the border, and other items related to our border security.
So it sounds like he's trying to win over some people from the Republican Party as well, doing his best that he can there, knowing that former President Donald Trump has a lot of support right now and a good bit of momentum, too.
Yeah, I think one of the things that President Biden's going to be trying to do is going to try to shore up really a relatively new coalition to the Democratic Party, the never Trump wing of the Republican Party. Maybe those folks, for example, who were behind former Ambassador Haley, President Biden trying to get into that. And I think that also is being calculated upon the fact that many political analysts right now think that the one area where the president may be the most soft in a traditionally Democratic-friendly demographic is younger voters, particularly younger voters who are not pleased with the way this president is handling the situation in Gaza. So the president can try to shore up his Democratic base while also trying to make himself more appealing to those Republicans who just can't bring themselves to vote for former President Trump in the fall.
Sure, sure. Any other big challenges that you see sticking out? Of course, you pointed out his age, and he's gotten a lot of criticism for his age there. Anything else that really stands out to you?
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see over the summer months when we really get into the grueling, you know, to the conventions and then past the conventions, how much is this president going to be able to campaign?
How much is former President Trump going to campaign? Again, neither one of these gentlemen, people keep making President Biden's age a concern or an issue in this race. Former President Trump is no spring chicken either. Will they actually decide for the first time in a very long time in modern presidential politics not to have a debate? Will we see both of these gentlemen go head to head? So I think as we move forward, President Biden trying to make sure that he very, very much and carefully curates the kind of events that he's going to and doesn't let the momentum of this night, where at least for this moment in time, he looked like he was ready to go. He was fiery. He was ready to bring an agenda.
Sure. Very interesting, and it's going to be an incredibly interesting fall when we look at the campaign and election 2024.
History in the making. History in the making.
Yeah. Dr. Daniel Cronrath, thank you so much for coming on representing FSCJ's Political Science Department. Appreciate
Always.
you.
Thanks.